do people have questions? Do they want to, I mean, there's so many issues, right, that are going to require an enormous amount of collaboration. We can talk about compassionate use. We can talk about intellectual property. Anybody, I'm happy to do it up here, but I'm also happy to open up the floor if people have specific questions they want to, or topics they want to start with. Okay.
I would love to ask a question to the advocates out here.
Perfect.
How many advocates out here have published with their scientists on papers?
Nice, very nice. That's great.
And I think that's actually a big key, because when I was hearing the panel talk that the team work together, publishing with your scientists is key.
So there
that's
you go.
True collaboration.
True collaboration, so that's a great, because the patient, it moves forward what the patients want, and it also addresses what the academics need. So that's actually a great example. So, all right, let's just start with academics. So you already mentioned one thing that's, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Martin Broom, Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. Question around compassionate use. So I'm a cancer biologist by training, and I know something about the MAP kinase pathway and RAS, and I know enough that, for instance, BRAF mutations in melanoma, drugs that were designed to treat that disease were actually, they taught us lessons once we went into the clinic in terms of feedback and unexpected consequences of treatment. So that raises some concerns around compassionate use of drugs that are not fully explored in the clinic. Now, understanding, there may be, as in the case of cancer, a big unmet need there. Patients are, essentially dying of the disease, and can make some exceptions in terms of safety there. What do you consider a reasonable cutoff for a patient that, is not at a life-threatening situation, may be expected to have a reasonable, success in terms of, quality of living, quality of life? What do you consider a cutoff that's reasonable in terms of compassionate use?
So that's actually a really great question. And again, the group of syndromes that I work on are RASopathies. These include neurofibromatosis type 1, Noonan syndrome, Costello syndrome, CFC syndrome, capillary malformation syndrome, Leach's syndrome. And actually, there have been a couple cases in RASopathy patients, because hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is something that is life-threatening for some of these kids. And interestingly enough, mTOR inhibitors, so not part of the RAS-MAPK pathway, but the PI3 kinase pathway downstream, mTOR and mTORC, have been used for compassionate use in early on newborns. And the type of scenario that I was giving early on, going to these drug companies, that was actually looking into very well-defined clinical trials, not in compassionate use. But again, you bring up a really good question. Yes, there are a lot of small molecule inhibitors. And actually, again, for some of these individuals, that has been done. But I actually don't know of a small molecule inhibitor like a farnesyl transferase inhibitor or anything for the MAPK pathway. But I do know that an mTOR inhibitor has been used for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I don't know the outcome. And so that actually sparked a clinical trial that is underway, actually. That was a great question. Thank you.
So if we just keep going on compassionate use in terms of, and I know I've talked to both of Jane, you and Barbara about that, but maybe you could share a little bit about sort of an industry perspective. I know small versus large, or what you have to deal with.
Yeah, compassionate use it's a very tricky area, because you have certainly the needs of patients who want to access an investigational drug, and particularly in these very small study clinical trials or small patient population clinical trials, you want to make sure that should you grant compassionate use, that there's not going to be something that could happen in the compassionate use, an adverse, serious, or severe adverse event that may have a bad effect on the clinical trial. So typically what is said is, when a compassionate use is not allowed is that the study must continue, there must be adequate safety understood, and that it's better to look at the greater good than the good of one. That is probably something everybody has heard or read about in the media, particularly with some of the more controversial compassionate use cases that have been out there. At Amicus, we do have a very modest compassionate use program, and frankly, not too many physicians have taken advantage of it, but they have. And it is a physician-initiated request. So what it means is that the family, the patient, must go through a physician to request access to compassionate use, and then we have an internal protocol that's also cross-functional, and patient advocacy sits on that, along with medical affairs and the medical monitor from clinical research, the CMO, et cetera, to look at the request and to determine, is this appropriate? It's interesting that in some of these more recent, very controversial cases, we see, particularly when there's no other, treatment or possibility for medical assistance, that people are taking to social media, and that type of pressure, while the community feels that this is the way to go, almost to shame a company into doing something. It may end up working, that they gain access to that drug, but actually what is going to happen overall, you don't know what good or not good it's doing. The other piece that I'll just throw out there is that the FDA has often said that regardless what happens in a compassionate use situation, it will not affect your going for approval for that drug. But in industry, frankly, people don't necessarily believe that completely. So it's such a double-edged sword for everybody. I wouldn't want anyone in the patient community to think for a minute that, particularly in the rare disease, orphan product industry side, that when there is a request, that it doesn't create much angst. And it's not about money that people do or don't, although certainly if you had a rush on compassionate use for something, it actually could jeopardize clinical supply of a medication. So that's another whole issue. But there is a lot of angst when these requests do come in, and they are looked at very seriously. They're looked at from so many different perspectives, and I wouldn't begin to say that I understand where somebody is coming from, particularly if you're looking at a very severe oncology situation where there is nothing else. I mean, I'm talking right now about Fabry disease, where there happens to be standard of care, but the standard of care may not apply to everyone, and that's where it comes to us. But happy to answer any questions, but that's sort of how we approach it.
I would just comment, too, that one of the things that often happens in an early clinical trial situation is that companies don't have enough drug.
Right.
Because frequently, for a phase 1, phase 2 trial, drug is manufactured in a research lab, and so they don't make buckets of it. They make enough for the trial. So oftentimes companies will say, no, they won't give you a drug because giving you the drug is going to delay the enrollment of the trial, which means that nobody gets the drug. So I think there's a lot of confounding variables in a company's decision to grant compassionate use. The one thing I say is determine your policy before you start your trial.
Absolutely.
Because halfway through the trial is not the time to decide what you're going to do. And I think if you say you're not going to do it and you offer reasonable explanations, people will hopefully understand that you are well-meaning, you are just bound by other constrictions. But if you wait till you're halfway through the trial and then say no,
And just,
looks like you don't care.
and to that point, I mean, what Barb is talking about is transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Transparency of communications, whether it's around your compassionate use policy, whether it's around something that may not be going according to plan with the development of a product, and I think that's the basis for these types of collaborations.
That's probably another key, right? Transparency in any type of collaboration.
Right.
Absolutely.
So if anybody has a question, if you just go stand at the microphones or raise your hand.
Hi, shifting gears just a little bit, wanted to talk about IP. collectively, this room has probably invested many times over millions of dollars. And just can anyone speak as to how can organizations be a little more savvy about securing IP with their researchers so that they're not just continually giving dollars over every year and not receiving a piece of that research? What are the benefits of it? Things of that nature.
You want to start?
I would just say best practices. That's one thing. We have a pretty decent template, I think, for grant agreements that allows at least for some piece of the IP to be retained by the foundation. I'd be happy to share that with you. I'm trying to think of Faster Cures. I'm sure has some very good resources on this, and what Sharon Terry works at the Genetic Alliance. They also, I think, do. So I would just go to them and ask for them.
I think that's a great question, though, intellectual property. And I don't know if does anybody else want to talk about?
I think it also depends where you are at your stage, like your foundation or where your disease is relative to others. I know in the case of NGLI1, we're not really focused on it. At this point, we're just trying to get some of the basic research up and running and get them the tools and the resources that they need to do their job. And you know what? If they find a cure, then God bless them, and I hope they make a lot of money doing it. But it's not something that we're looking at a windfall to then reinvest, although maybe down the road that's a possibility.
Now, we've heard stories, I've heard stories that if you could have a patient organization that could raise money, they could turn it over to a researcher, the researcher could start working in that area, and then they turn it over to, say, a small biotech who decides they can make more money with a bigger indication.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on each institution. Some are much more savvy than others. I mean, just like one case in point in the case of NGLI1 is that Stanford University is really tight in terms of IP, and it's just not worth the battle to go and say, hey, I'm going to invest X number of dollars, and I want to have the rights on the back end to it. It's sort of like you're almost swimming upstream unnecessarily, not knowing what's actually going to come from the research, and I think for all of us, it's all about removing friction wherever possible, and it's probably not a battle that's necessary up front. And if the science actually does lead to something that's interesting, you're going to be the first person to know about it, and that's when a conversation can happen. But I would recommend removing as much friction and taking a step back. Let the scientists do their job.
I would add to that. I think that's really true, and I've seen a number of occasions where things just slow down, and I'm thinking, I don't care who gets rich off of this, but it is important to make sure that as part of whatever agreements are reached, the indication for which the drug has been developed, which is going to be the indication for your child or for you or whatever, that's protected, that the drugs used for that indication is protected, and it doesn't start being used for something else, and all of a sudden they forget about the rare disease.
Absolutely.
I think it's a good indication too that if you are anticipating, a discovery, or you have a discovery, that you have to start very early talking about what's going to happen to that property. Who discovered it and who has the rights to it, and then how will you transfer those rights and what are the agreements. So I think whatever you do, you have to involve the legal departments very early on to make sure that what Jonathan mentioned, that you don't run into a 6-9 month delay or a year delay as you haggle the agreement. And we've heard about this, and it's rather disconcerting to see it occurring, because the research slows down, and it's a tremendous delay.
I just have a quick comment on the venture philanthropy. What we've seen is some patient organizations are actually using it as a way to get more investment. It's more of an incentive for people to give bigger dollars to help you develop that drug, because they know that then you will reinvest should it become something. So it's been a way to help raise and attract new funding. Just wanted to share.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most successful at that's been the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is just just dominated. It's been super successful. But then it's a question of how many dollars are they investing, where, one of our rare diseases, maybe if we're lucky, you're investing $1 million a year, $2 million a year, and they're dropping, $50 million a year. It's the scale, I think, has an impact on the venture philanthropy model, at least from my perspective.
I have a question. Oops.
Sorry. It's okay, Robert, you can start.
Just to get back to compassionate use, I think for the benefit of this audience, if somebody on the panel can comment on compassionate use. For example, we have seen Ebola getting so much attention in terms of getting material out to patients to treat 1 or 2 people. But in terms of pediatric cancer, it's the same thing. I mean, human life is human life, right? So in terms of comparing numbers and comparing diseases, it's hard to kind of understand it, but if you can elaborate on that, please, or explain. Thanks.
Does the NIH have a position on that? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think it's an individual investigator working with the patients, and then the FDA to receive the permission to, use that product for compassionate use. So you do have to go through, and I think what everybody says is make sure you collect the good data as you go on, so that you really can draw, hopefully, even from one patient, that you can draw some conclusions that will be useful. Especially if you're meeting with success in the treatment, so how do we expand this study?
So what you're saying is, like, when you bring up the Ebola case, because you could look at that from the outside and say, well, it's because the Ebola has been in the newspaper and it scares everybody, and so it's more likely to go out to patients than even if the same number of children are dying from another but rare disease that no one's scared of getting.
Yeah, and I think what has happened too, and it was mentioned earlier, I think in the pediatric oncology network, how easy it seems to be at times to open a protocol for so many of the oncology disorders, especially in the peds patients, and so it's how do we utilize that same factor for so many of the rare diseases that are themselves deadly, and without treatment. And I think that's a big question that I don't think we've answered well enough yet, and I think it's something we should really focus on moving into the future. Now that there are more and more interactions between the research community and regulatory authorities, that we should begin to address this a little bit more, so that we don't seem to be behind so much with serious rare diseases for which there are no treatments, but yet there might be something. And how do we make sure that the patients who need the treatment, if there is some intervention available, really becomes available when they need it as quickly as possible? And it sort of throws around the issue. What I was thinking of too is a repurposing of approved drugs, or drugs that never made it to the marketplace. And we've got a little bit of an effort there at NCATS with Christine Colvis leading this. But it's a tremendously large potential there that I think we haven't really addressed sufficiently. I think people would like to, but it requires considerable resources. That's money and people to do this. But I think we really do have to utilize our resources and the IT capabilities. I think we do need to look at how we can do this better. People are talking about patient registries, natural history studies, electronic health record information. So what are we doing to find out what patients are taking outside of their normal regimen, if anything, and what's happening? And so I think it's important that we begin to address that issue as well as we move forward.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, does anybody out there know about Cures Within Reach? Do you guys know about that? Because glad you brought up repurposing. If you, is anybody working with Cures Within Reach? Oh, well, maybe you could tell us about it in a minute. But it's a not-for-profit that works on repurposing drugs that are already out there, and they use a publishing strategy, so it's much faster, much cheaper to get safe drugs with some kind of research behind them. So, you have a question?
Here I am, and I'm like adding and adding and adding. So, we have I just wanted to mention that when we were talking about partnering with the advocacy organizations, that what we also need, and we here, we're the Converted, are getting mentorships. So one of the reasons why I'm here is through organizations like Global Genes, like the Genetic Alliance like NORD, I was able to meet people like Steve Groft and Kate Rowan, and they helped us get from support group to advocacy group. So I was the president of Costello Syndrome Family Network. I was pushed into being the founder and president of the Rasopathies Network now, and can't do it without everyone's support. So my request to the professionals in this room is don't expect the advocates to come to you necessarily. Go to them or listen to them and support them, mentor them, encourage them to come to meetings like this so that they can network and find peers to support them and come along.
Wendy, could I respond? I'd like to respond to that. I think that's a great comment, and the beauty of this community has always been that type of help and mentorship and support you get from each other and all of us, regardless of who the stakeholder is. The one thing I would like people in the advocacy community to realize is that for those of us on the industry side, things are changing. There are compliance guidelines that we must adhere to. So while it sounds wonderful to say, reach out to the advocacy organizations, support them, et cetera, that can be done, absolutely, but it has to be done within certain guidelines. So even though we in industry may know you're there or you have built it, it doesn't mean that we will come, because we can't. We can't just in a very obvious way reach out. The requests for support, the requests for grants have to come from the community to industry. We cannot tell you how to do it until those initial requests come in. Similarly, just around exchanging of information, for the most part, in a situation like this, we can certainly have conversation. However, somebody from a patient organization has to approach industry and say, I'd like to know more about the work you're doing, or I would like to share with you something about my disease or my community's disease to see if it has any relevance to work that you are doing. So there are some things where the approach has to come because of compliance, and one of the things that we've done through the Patient Access Committee of Global Genes Corporate Alliance is we've developed a toolkit about how to approach industry, how to approach biotech and pharma companies, and it's almost done. It's not completely cooked, but we encourage people to look at these toolkits. They are dynamic documents. They're not engraved in stone, and there's a list, I know, and Nicole, and they didn't tell me to say this. In your books, there's a whole list of toolkits that currently are available, and then you should know that we're working on others. But I think the main thing is that we've tried to put together ways to help the community learn how to access industry. But as you go through those toolkits and read them, and I hope use them, I hope you'll come back to the Corporate Alliance or certainly through the staff of Global Genes to say, hey, this worked or this didn't. But when it comes to advocacy, that's a really important thing to understand, that what we can do is changing, and the FDA is getting stricter and stricter and more like Europe.
Thanks. I think Jane made a good point about compassionate access that I wanted to kind of highlight and had a follow-up question. And that was that, the FDA has published and made certain statements that they say that adverse events won't affect the ongoing drug development program, but that pharma doesn't generally believe that. And I think personally we had that experience with a friend of mine's son in attempting to secure compassionate access. So my question would be, what specific assurances would make pharma companies generally more comfortable to engage in earlier compassionate access, or what type of framework? Because I think many patient advocates would be very interested in making that type of framework happen because the process does take so long, and we see promising drugs then have to go for another 5 years while kids keep dying.
I see Julia Jenkins walking by. There she is. There she is. I wanted to pull her into this discussion, but she's outside.
I'll take a stab at this. The concept that doing a compassionate use trial and getting negative data could impact your NDA approval, your new drug application approval, is somewhat of an urban legend. that's been around in pharma for a long, long time. I was at a meeting a month ago and talked with Richard Klein from FDA. I raised the question in the meeting and I said, is that true? And he said, no, it's not. But he said, I have heard that before. And I said, well, I've heard it 1,000 times. But he said, really, FDA is not expecting that the data from a compassionate use trial or a compassionate use patient will be useful data to an NDA submission. The patients that are asking for compassionate use are at the end of the line in terms of treatment. So the likelihood that the drug will save them is not great. You do have to report the safety. Part of what happened is a serious adverse event, but it does not actually get rolled into your NDA submission. So that is an important point of clarification, because I have heard it many, many times, but it is not true.
One thing to remember also, for most of the rare disorders, we don't have a good understanding of the natural history of the disease that we would say the natural history. And so it's very difficult many times to separate the impact of a treatment from what is happening due to the disease.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as we go along, we have to generate more information that we actually understand the disease, the course of the disease across the lifespan. And then when you interject a product, what happens? Are the results due to the intervention, or is it the natural course of the disease progressing or regressing depending on the response to the treatment? So I think what we're trying to do also is bring this emphasis to the natural history following the disease and making those comparisons as we go along.
Right.
It's very, very helpful. And this is where I think the big data efforts that what people are talking about will come into play too. We actually begin to understand the diseases much better.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to ask the researchers and the scientists on the panel their opinion about some recent articles which I've seen published by NORD and Benaroya Institute out at Virginia Mason last week about researchers and scientists conducting outside of the box of normal science and the accomplishments and the findings, the good findings that they've had recently. And they also brought to light that as a norm, the researchers that strayed from normal science were also being chastised by their peers for doing so. So what they had done is they actually compared the results with the fact that that type of research was being frowned upon. I just wondered if they had any thoughts on that.
I think that sort of depends on what you mean by outside of the box. I don't know the specifics that you're talking about, but some years ago I got involved again because of this Mano stuff with a company that was basically out there saying, you take our drug or our supplement, and it's got mannans. God gave us that. And read these articles about what Manos can do. And you know that this stuff will really work because we've seen it. We can't say that. And the reason is because there are regulations. But we know it will cure cancer. We know it will take care of Down syndrome. It has cured alcoholism. This thing went on and on. Eventually there was an ABC News 2020 episode on this. And probably if I'm ever remembered for anything, it will be the one comment I made on there. They said, does it do this? No. Does it do anything? I said, yes, it increases flatulence. That's in the literature. But the but the point is you can go off and that's not real science. It's pseudoscience.
I understand. Please, I should have clarified that the research was done by accredited institutions, by accredited scientists, and it was justified results that were given.
I don't know the specific. So
okay.
Maybe it was really great, but
I recall one of them had to do with partial proteins or partial molecules retraining T cells for autoimmune disease. That one came out of Benaroya Institute, I believe.
You know, look, when Stanley Prusner first said that, you know, you could have a pathological protein, nobody believed him. And then he had to fight like hell to get that accepted, and then he got a Nobel Prize for it. So you can be outside the box in some things, but I think one of the tenets of science is that if you're outside the box, you better bring some big boxing gloves, you know, to show that you've got the answer right. And that's what it really comes down
And
to.
I think, too, you want to look also, you know, high risk and potential high reward. So I think there's a place for a certain amount of the research that will lead to some really fabulous discoveries. And as HUD mentioned, what Stanley Prusner found, other disorders, the same things have occurred where people say, oh, that's not going to work and doesn't make any sense. But sometimes it does.
Okay, one last question. Oh, sure. Can somebody, or you can have mine.
About 2 months ago, our daughter was diagnosed with pemphigus vulgaris, and 2 years ago, she was a healthy college student, and she went to give blood, and she fainted, so she wasn't able to, and she came back. There were some people from the Be the Match program, so they swabbed her cheek and said, it's really rare to be the match for somebody, but she ended up 2 years later being the match, a potential match for somebody. So she decided to give her stem cells. And I know this is part of science of what we're doing right now. I'm just a housewife, layperson, so all of this has been really overwhelming for me. But when we found out that pemphigus vulgaris had some connections with maybe some genetic propensities, I started looking at the people groups, you know, like the Ashkenazi Jews, and who are struggling with cancer. I saw an article just recently that they want to screen them with breast cancer because they're getting breast cancer, lots of them. And I think in the Mediterranean and in Brazil, there's people groups that have pemphigus vulgaris. But we had no connection in the United States as to why my 24-year-old daughter, who was healthy, why she would get pemphigus. And so what I'm asking you as researchers, I want to see, she's kind of an anomaly, and sometimes anomalies can be answers, but I don't have technology. I have no way to look into that. We're here to see if we can help other people. There's nothing we can do for Hannah as far as she's got pemphigus. Okay, we'll deal with that. We'll go down that road. The person that she gave her stem cells to survived. You know, that was great. But I want to make sure that we were thinking that maybe the medicine that they used to harvest her stem cells, which made her body produce more stem cells, and then it shoots into your bloodstream and they harvest them through the centrifuge, that maybe that triggered her reaction, triggered whatever maybe was in her genetic makeup. You know, it doesn't take a lot to sometimes trigger mutation, but maybe in that triggering could be an answer. So I'm kind of reaching out at this point. Is there anybody on this panel, and you guys have been through a lot of research and you've seen a lot of things. It's not just about the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few and the one, which understand Hannah's one person in a whole bunch of people. We went back to the Be the Match program or the Oklahoma Blood Institute, which is where we're from, Oklahoma, and they just kind of pushed us aside and didn't address, so here we are. I think for the sake of other people that could fall into that category of, I don't even know what the term, I'm sorry, my head is full of anxiety to stand here, but risk versus benefit, yeah. Maybe I'm the devil's advocate here, but our family's suffering with something because somebody used what is I guess, a medicine that is really out there. Neupogen is a big drug, like big money-making drug, and it's a cancer drug. So we don't want it to be taken off the market. But we were thinking maybe if we could find a genetic, if there is an anomaly, that it could be tagged so that if somebody else was a healthy donor, they wouldn't find themselves in the rare community like we found ourselves.
Well, it sounds to me, and I'm not a scientist or a physician, but it sounds to me as if what you're asking is, could there be some way to screen for people before they go and do these wonderful donations, if you will, and make sure that there's not going to be something in the process that could harm them if they happen to be a carrier for something, or they have a mutation which they're completely asymptomatic, and it's this trigger, it's this assault, if you will. It's similar to DPD deficiency, where people who have one form of it are completely asymptomatic, but then there's a rather traditional form of chemotherapy that kind of turns on that, and they have a severe, if not fatal, reaction to it. But a screening for it, you'd know if somebody has that deficiency, you wouldn't administer that particular type of chemo. So is that what you're asking? Okay. Now, so there you go, Doc.
So we would be the types of doctors that we see cases like this. I mean, with families coming to us, is there some kind of genetic connection? Is there something that had happened? Is this a precipitating event? And I would actually also garner the opinions of the other advocates, either on the panel or in the room, as to how were they successful in going down the road and getting answers. And I think I've heard many times over, it's asking and talking to everybody, talking to your physicians, going and seeing a medical geneticist or a genomicist, because that's a great genetic question. And so that's what I would do. I would talk to all the physicians and ask for medical genetics and go see a medical geneticist. Medical genetics? We should talk after.
There should be someone,
There's
there
medical
at university.
So
Yeah,
what
we'll
I
get you
can help,
connected.
what we can do is I'll find out where you live, and we can see about medical genetics in your area. Medical geneticists, and our names are probably changing to genomicists soon, but we don't hang our shingle on the street. We are part of university hospitals because part of what we do is investigation. We try to figure out what the molecular lesion is in somebody who presents with signs and symptoms, and no one knows what it is. I mean, that's...
We think we found a trigger, and I just thought if we came here, we might find help for someone else. I mean, here we are.
I
That's
completely
okay.
understand
You know
what
what?
you're saying.
It's perfect. And I think we're sort of coming to the end, but
need
it'd
to find you
be
a physician.
fantastic. And anybody else who has very specific issues, Nancy?
I want to address what this woman just said.
Okay.
Microphone.
I think that the fact that you sat here for 2 days and at the end of this, you're raising this issue, brings to mind, I mean, we are so fortunate to have a panel like this and have an organization like this and have a forum like this. But a couple of years ago, there was a book called The Secret. I don't know if anybody knew what The Secret was, but it kind of implied that if you benefit of being here. And I think that, you know, the fact that you're asking those questions and you said what you said deserves some attention.
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you, Nancy. And aren't there other members of the Pemphigus Foundation in the audience? Yes.
Wendy, if I could just mention something too. We have what's called the Genetic and Rare Diseases Information Center, and it's staffed primarily by genetic counselors. And we do have a number of physician consultants who work with them. So I want you to see me after the meeting, and maybe working through the global genes, we can hear from others who are experiencing the same problems, that perhaps we can pose this to the information center and come up with a little bit of a process to respond to your needs. They're there, they respond to questions. I mean, you know, after all these years, and you still look at the statistics of people who are seeking information, and it's doubling. We've doubled the number of inquiries just since last year. And so it's a lot of people still seeking information. It's not the perfect world yet that you can find information despite all the search engines. We still get a lot of personal phone calls. Many times the individuals don't know how to interpret the information. There may be so much information, they don't know what to make of all that information. So I don't have a slide with that right now, but it is something we can talk about later, but it's called the Genetic and Rare Disease Information Center, GARD. And we provide information to a lot of other groups. There's another group called OrphanNet in France. Information is made available from NORD, from Genetic Alliance, and others. So there are a lot of resources. And any of you who have a disorder that you feel you don't have sufficient information and you don't know how to find it, please, I'm here until tomorrow night, and Global Genes can always help you find me, and we'll help you try to locate what information to make your lives a little bit better.
So I know that we're actually past time and that the cocktail party is starting, but maybe that's a really poignant way to end this whole day and think about how far we still have to go, and the fact that it's really going to require collaboration from all of these different disciplines and frankly from all of us in the room. So all of these people, I hope, will all be at the cocktail party.
Yes.
And so if there are any other questions, and we can just continue the discussion. So thank you very much.